Hi, I'm Dr. Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician here at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, and your host today on the Kids Health Info podcast. Well, this week across Australia, we've seen a world first. The new under 16 social media age restrictions have been rolled out. As a mum of teens and a paediatrician caring for lots of young people, I know I've got questions, and we know you do at home as well. So joining us today from the Office of the eSafety Commissioner is Paul Clark, the Executive Manager for Education, Prevention and Communities. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Anthea. Great to be here.
From the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, this is the Kids Health Info podcast.
We'd love to start with a little bit of a summary about exactly what has been rolled out with these new regulations.
Well, from the 10th of December, Australia's social minimum age law came into effect. And what is really interesting is this is genuinely a world first reform that is about putting the responsibility back onto the platforms. So what that really means from a practical point of view is that some of the platforms that are really well known, like Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube, it's going to be their responsibility to take reasonable steps to ensure that children under the age of 16 don't have accounts. These obligations simply delay a kid's access to some of the high-risk account features that really are exposing them to the harm. So it's things like algorithmic amplification, recommender systems that really push harmful and extreme material, and also about sharing and live streaming some of the events that occur. So the law itself applies to what's defined legally as an age-restricted social media platform. And what that means is these are services whose sole or significant purpose is to enable social interaction. We keep saying it, but it's really important to note that there are no penalties for parents. There are no penalties for children. This is really about putting the onus back on the platform. It's about buying young people a bit more time to grow, build the digital skills they need, and to step into social media safely when they're ready and able.
So many questions, I guess, that come off the back of that, and really helpful to understand the why, which I think, we have heard a lot about. But the things that parents perhaps might be grappling with, and young people themselves, is sort of how this is all working in reality now that it's being rolled out. So I guess one first question, perhaps one that's a little bit more straightforward, which platforms are actually included? What's been part of the new regulation in terms of meeting those criteria that you've just described?
At the moment, the law applies to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and I have to remember all these, Snapchat, YouTube, X or Twitter, Reddit, Threads, Kik and Twitch. Now, this is a list that's going to be constantly reviewed and updated. It's never going to be a list that sets in stone because some platforms are really going to up their ante and make themselves less risky for young people to use, and there are going to be new players in the field and other platforms that young people go to that are going to present other risks. So it is one of those things where we're going to be keeping a constant watch, and those platforms will come and go.
I'll pick up on something you mentioned just there, which is new players in the field. So I've got teenagers myself, so I'm living this on multiple levels at home, in the workplace, and I'm certainly hearing really already that there are new apps that may have been there before but have rapidly sort of rising to the fore as another option. And I'm also hearing from young people a lot about workarounds. So what sort of advice have you got there for parents who might be listening to that and thinking, oh, this all sounds really hard?
I suppose my first step is to always say go to our social media minimum age hub at eSafety.gov.au because that's going to have the most up-to-date information. There are lots of Q&As. We've really worked through with mental health organisations and parent orgs and young people themselves to find out what they need and want to know and to find out. The thing is, these platforms change and shift all the time. One of the big things we're seeing is that part of the risk is when we have those big numbers of young kids together, and that's when platforms can really monetize and sort of the higher risk is. Sure, kids are definitely going to be moving to other platforms, but there's not going to be that great mass of everyone's on this platform, so I must be on that platform. I think an important part to remember too with this legislation is that it's not about defining what's safe and not safe. What the legislation was about is there's some really unsafe operating features in social media platform when it comes to mental health for young people. So just because a platform is not included in this at the moment doesn't mean, oh, that's fine, safe, don't worry about it, let the kids go. It's really important that parents have those conversations with kids. understand. Ask your kids, so what platforms are you using? What are you using them for? Who do you chat to them? And being aware of, well, are there parental controls? One of the things that came up for us, I think, a while back now, is we did some research, and there are about 2.5 million Australian children between 8 to 15 who are already using social media. When you think about it, those platforms have a minimum age of 13. So there's a lot of kids already who are on those platforms, some with parental consent, some with parental help, who are on platforms that are really way set at a maturity level of way beyond where they are already. And it's on those platforms that we see that kids are much more likely to experience things like cyberbullying or grooming or access to violent and sexual content and even self-harm material. They just really weren't designed for children. So that's why this whole piece is around hopefully empowering parents to really engage with the kids about how they're using platforms and to just be aware of the parental controls and what they can do to help their kids have safe experiences.
And so you've mentioned there the idea that content might be there that wasn't intended for those younger children who've found their way onto platforms. I know one of the worries that people have about the new legislation is that if we've got platforms who are saying, well, we're going to keep everyone under 16 off the platform because that's now our legal responsibility, does that open up the doors for them to have more concerning content with the reasoning being, well, it was never intended for younger kids, and yet it might be they still find their way there?
So that's one of the challenges we're finding, and this is just one of the arsenals that the eSafety Commissioner has. So we've got, without getting kind of too heavy on the legal side, but we have a whole series of codes and standards and basic online safety expectations, which are about holding the platforms to account. So one of the arguments is, if the child is registered and they say that they're 16, they're in a safer environment because they say they're 16. But if they're on the platform and we don't know what that age they are or they're not registered, then they could come across all this awful content. And really the question to ask about the platforms is, why is there open content that any child at any age or any person could access suddenly too frightening for a 16-year-old to see? So this is part of the pressure piece around ensuring that the platforms have got mechanisms in place to make sure that those younger people and more vulnerable people aren't just stumbling across violent, sexualized content, health-defining content that can really trigger eating disorders, self-harm, those kind of real mental health issues that we're seeing young people struggle with.
And so if young people themselves, or indeed parents or caregivers, or perhaps, health professionals become aware of worrying content, the sorts of things that you've just described, what sort of advice have you got as to what they might do about that? How can we be working together with the eSafety Office to make sure that we are holding platforms accountable for this sort of thing?
It really is, and this is what we're hoping that part of this legislation will do, and we've seen it happen already, but it's so much in the media now. People are talking about it, and that is great. What we want parents and carers, aunts and uncles and friends and family to sit down and ask kids, how are you using the platform? What platform are you using? We've got some get ready guides and conversation starters to really help with some of those conversations. And we really want to push that point that this is not a punishment in any way for young people. This isn't about a punitive measure because of their behaviours online. This is really, as we said, about holding the platforms to account. So we say to parents, keep the chat short, sharp and regular. Look at the platforms they're using, find out about them, maybe even sign up yourself and have a play with them. One of the other big pieces is, how do we model responsible technology use ourselves as adults? It's okay to say to the kids, get off the phone at the table if you're sitting there scrolling yourself. So it's like, how do you as a family unit say, okay, it's a certain time of the night now, we've decided we're not going to have our phones out anymore. We'll charge them in the kitchen, no devices in the bedroom. We're not going to have, while we catch up with dinner or we're going out with friends, we're not going to have our phones at the table. But hopefully parents will see this too, and we've heard from some of our parent groups how this is almost a good excuse to put that phone away themselves and help model the behaviour they're talking about.
You're absolutely right. It's always going to be a whole family approach, and sometimes easier said than done.
Yes, definitely.
One of the things that we're hearing about is I guess, a level of distress or worry among young people about losing their community. So we know that we've got a generation, if you like, of young people who have to a certain extent, grown up with social media, and that's what they know as their normal. And many of them are really very heavily reliant on these networks for their day-to-day feeling of connection, perhaps even just filling their time. That is part of what every day has looked like through a really critical developmental period, and taking that away is really complicated. So parents are keen to understand how to best support their young people through that.
We're really aware of this, and we've worked with a lot of the mental health organisations in the development of some of our resources for that reason. And I think it's really important for everyone to acknowledge the kids' feeling in this situation. Like, this is a generation that have grown up. It's a part of their arm. They're connected to it. That's how they connect with their friends. So really acknowledging their feelings. For many kids, this is going to be a big change in how they communicate. So it's part of the legislation, and what we keep reminding people is messaging apps aren't included. Gaming apps aren't included. So there's plenty of other ways that kids already connect with their friends that they'll still be able to do. Part of the Get Ready guides and the Get Ready conversations we're saying is sit down with your kids and, okay, check who of your friends you only connect with on social media. Do you have their phone numbers? Are they on your messaging app? Have you got them set up on WhatsApp or Signal or Messenger? Or how else can you communicate with them? And one of the other things too is around that, well, what are we going to do on Saturday morning if we're not kind of sitting around chatting to our friends online? Hey, how about, do you want to have your friends over? Do you want to go out and do something? It's kind of that it is going to be this real shift. So it's really important, number one, to acknowledge kids' feeling and don't just brush it off. But number two, try and think of some mitigating activities that you know that are going to get them active, get them moving, and get them connecting with their friends.
One of the other things that I'm hearing, and this has always been a big challenge, I think, through adolescence, is this idea that if people are perhaps split into different groups, so there might be young people who are following the new kind of rules and legislation. There might be young people where the whatever processes for age verification have been effective and they've actually had their access to these platforms removed or shut down. And then there's young people who are kind of, for whatever reason, they've found a workaround, or they're in an alternative group where they're continuing to actually use the social media space as a really key everyday part of how things are working for them. And that gets really difficult then for teenagers to navigate.
I think that is going to be complex, and I think we use lots of analogies in eSafety, but we talk about the drinking laws. It's like there are some parents who are more permissive than others, and it's like, you're looking at, well, those kids were all drinking on Friday night. Why wasn't I allowed to? There's going to be those kind of social issues, but there's also going to be the challenge of age discordant kids in a group where you've got, at a certain point of the year, you've got half the class are over 16 and are back on social media, the other half are not. And I think that's where we're looking at the importance of gaming apps and around messaging apps. It's like, how are kids engaging with each other? How can you support them to remain connected with their friends so that there's not that exclusionary piece happening?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really difficult path to walk, and it'll take parents, young people and educators and teachers, because obviously this is all taking place, really during that peak mid-high school period where there's lots of other kind of professionals involved as well.
And I think, and this reflects back to the point that this truly is a world first. We know there are so many other countries now that are looking at this. The harms are recognised around this constant scrolling and the impact that algorithms can have on young people's minds and mental health and well-being. But these initial days are going to be the interesting piece to see how the platforms operate, how successful they are in identifying. Part of our regulatory guidance is that there should be reporting tools for people. So whether it's a parent or a sibling or whoever wants to report and say actually they are under 16, that's a possibility. But we know that there's going to be false positives as well. So part of our regulatory guidance is platforms should be offering clear pathways for people to make appeals and say, for example, hey, you've age-gated me incorrectly. I really want my content back or my platform back. And part of that too is around the whole process. So it started happening, before the 10th of December, and it's ongoing now, how the different platforms are going to do this. But one of the key things for us is around offering young people the agency to say, please just put my account on hold. When I hit 16, I want it all back again. But for a lot of young people, especially I talked a little bit earlier about some kids are on as young as 8 years of age. You may have a 15-year-old who goes, you know what, I want to wipe that history. When I sign up again, I want a clear slate. So we've said to platforms, they're the kinds of things they need to try and take into account as well, to give the power back to the young people around how they want to engage with social media moving forward.
So important that we do continue to put young people in that, position of empowerment here. One of the other things that's emerged, there's been a lot of discussion about worries around security of data, particularly in relation to age verification. So asking young people to obviously share an image, share identification documents, and concerns and questions around where that goes. What reassurance have you got for parents there?
I think it depends on the platform, and each platform is going to have its own mechanisms for this. The kind of visual identity work that is happening, it actually is quite technical and will track the points of a person's face. It's not going to record an image or a face. And so once that's verified, it's kind of those verification points that are noted, and that child will be kind of deemed at a certain age. It is interesting that, on social media, we put so much of our lives up. We share where we live, who our best friends are. There's more selfies floating around than you can imagine, but it's like if you get asked to show your selfie, it can be kind of confronting. It's like, well, what's going to happen with that one? So I think in the context of all the information, the data the social media companies already have about us, one of the key parts that we talk about is that government ID cannot be asked as the only way of identification. So it is possible to be used if it's kind of like a backstop or the individual wants to use them themselves, but it's not something that a platform can upfront say, this is the only way we're going to verify your account. There are many different methods. There was a French company that through the age verification that are looking at hands and will get you to put your hand up near your face and can judge age by hand. It's so technically incredible what is happening. None of it's foolproof. And as we said, the next couple of months are going to see how that does pan out. But we're working very closely with the Australian Privacy and Information Commissioner as well. So while eSafety is responsible for the platform regulation piece, the Privacy Commissioner is looking very closely at how the platforms behave insofar as managing young people's data and information.
And so what I'm hearing there, Paul, is if a young person is being asked for ID as, the only way they can prove of age to retain an account, that would not actually be compliant, that should be a red flag, and that what would you be advising them to do? Is there a channel they could reach eSafety around that, or what would be next steps?
Those next steps have to be through the platforms themselves should not be doing that, and be unlikely for them to do it. One of the things we're really aware of and we're trying to flag too is for people to be aware of scams. So if someone gets a random email or a text message that says, hey, we're from Facebook and we want to check your identity, please click on this link and prove your age, never do it. That always do it through the platform in a logged in state yourself. Young people, when they log into their social media platform, should be getting that message pop up saying, hey, we think you're under 16. Let's go through some steps now. How do you want to handle it? Let's verify your age. But again, it's going to be those tricky questions around that text message coming through or that random email saying they're from, whatever platform it might be. Please provide your information. That's a no-go.
I think that's a really important piece of advice there, and something we need to make sure we support young people to be alert to, because I know, looking at my teenager who's banging this age group at the moment, I think she would, probably follow any prompt if she thought it was going to provide her with a workaround, and I feel that might leave young people quite vulnerable, particularly with some new alternative platforms that seem to be really quickly emerging. What are the signs there, I guess, that something can happen pretty fast? We say, it won't happen that quickly, but something goes viral in less than 24 hours. So I think if teenagers are onto something and they want to make it happen fast, it will. So, what is it that we should be on the lookout for, perhaps as parents, as a red flag? Alternative sites, alternative apps, and what would we do if we saw something worrying?
In the eSafety guide, we do have a list of apps that are the most popular ones, and that's constantly changing because apps are popping up all the time. So that kind of gives a bit of a background about how they're used, some of the safety tips, where to go to for the parental controls or safety information. But you mentioned about young people being vulnerable here, but we're concerned about older Australians too, and people themselves who there's a lot of talk around everyone's going to have to verify their accounts. So that kind of being aware of not falling for that scam trap is really something we're really looking at too for older Australians. It's not just young people.
Absolutely. And just perhaps one other question before we wrap up. Something that I know some of my patients have asked me about is that kids are going to take this to court. What have you got sort of that you can give us in terms of an update there? That they're really determined, some young people, to see this overturned and, you know, trying to really advocate for themselves in that regard.
We are aware at the moment there is a constitutional challenge before the High Court. That is a matter for the courts at the moment, but we are still proceeding with the legislation as planned. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, not just in Australia, but internationally in these cases, and who tries it on, whether it be the platforms or different groups themselves. But with the real intent of helping protect young people and I should backtrack a little bit. Part of the evaluation of the program for us, which is really important, we've done our baseline study now, but we want to look at the long-term impacts that this has had on young people's lives. So that's pulling in together lots of different information to look at everything from NAPLAN results to time spent online to sleep impacts. So we're working with academics across a whole range of markers to really look after a 2-year period, what kind of impact has this legislation had on young people's mental health and well-being? And that's going to go both ways too, because we'll see where the faults lie maybe and legislation needs to be tweaked, but also too, we're really keen to see, we know the research about some of the harms, but we want to actually prove where the benefits lie.
In the eSafety office, you'll know this better than anyone, but keeping pace, I'm sure, is going to be a big part of the challenge because, we put something in place to deal with what we see as the current issue, but obviously that continues to evolve rapidly as well.
And platforms are developed all the time and, then kids discover them and use it for something completely different than
it was intended.
May have thought of in the first place, and and that's the ingenuity of young people, and they'll always be seeking that out. That's what really helps drive it forward, and the creativity and the way they engage, which is wonderful. And it's really not about stopping that. It's about looking at those platforms which we know have those really almost malicious structures within them that are feeding young people this harmful content on an ongoing basis, so to just kind of slow that down for a while until they've got the ability to deal with it.
Absolutely. So as you said, keeping that conversation happening with your young person, understanding that this is a really big, challenging change, that it might feel very hard for them, and not being dismissive of that, reaching out for support, and as parents, upskilling as much as we can so that we know what's going on and can be really informed to support our kids through these changes. Anything else before we finish up, Paul? Any final practical tips that you'd like to leave parents with today?
Please go to our social media minimum age hub at eSafety.gov.au. Chat to the kids in your lives, and even if they're not necessarily yours, find out how they're using technology, find out about what they're using and try it yourself. And also to look at what kind of parental controls or levers that are there within the app themselves to make them safer, rather than just kind of signing up and letting them go for it.
Absolutely. Thanks again for your time today. No doubt you will continue to be busy over the coming weeks and months. Thank you for all your work.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
And if you'd like to take a look at some of the resources that Paul's talked about, we'll pop a link in the show notes today so you can read them at home and have a look at them with your young person too. If your young person has been struggling with these changes, help is available. Lifeline, Headspace and KidsHelpline details are available in our show notes.
Information in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, discussions with your doctor or healthcare professional. If you have concerns about your child, please consult your local healthcare professional for individual advice. This podcast is recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay respects to their elders. Kids Health Info is funded thanks to the support of the Royal Children's Hospital Good Friday Appeal.